I believe that every musician should be using a high quality instrument cable. There is nothing worse than having your cheap, unreliable cable short out on you just before you hit the stage. But here's the thing, with those name brand boutique cables, they are really expensive. In today's video, I'm going to show you how you can make your own pro-grade instrument cables at home that are every bit as good, if not better, than those boutique brands. And they're a fraction of the cost. All you're going to need are a few components, some cable, and just a couple of basic soldering skills that I'm going to show you. I'm Jeff, you're watching Home Built Workshop, so let's get started. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I know for a fact that I am a sucker for a high quality instrument cable. I've been burned way too many times by the cheap ones because I didn't want to spend the money at the time for whatever reason. And I've learned that a very good quality cable can make or break your show or your gig or open mic, whatever it is you're doing. You definitely don't want your cable to be dying at the worst second because, well, we all know that that's when it's going to die. Before you can begin soldering your fancy new instrument cables, you need to make a couple of decisions, and those are basically on what kind of components, what kind of plugs, what kind of wire are you going to use. There's several different options, and really as long as you choose a high quality one, you can't really go wrong. One of my go-to plugs, and the one that we're going to be using today, are these Switchcraft number 280s. These are really common. You've probably seen them all over the place on a lot of cables that are already at the music store. While Switchcraft makes great products, they're not the only option out there. And really, I don't think you can go wrong as long as you're choosing one of the bigger name brands. I like Switchcraft, I like the Neutrik, and I've recently started using a brand called Reen. I don't have as much experience with them, but so far I haven't had any issues and they seem like high quality components. Really, that's the cool part. You get to choose what you want. We're going to be using the straight Switchcraft 280s today, but whatever you decide to use, as long as it's a good quality name brand, I would say you just can't go wrong and your cables are going to be awesome. So let's say you've chosen your jacks, you know what you're going to use. Now you need some cable. Much like the plugs, there's several options of this out there on the market as well. To make our custom cables, we're going to be using Mogami 2524. This is a roll of Mogami cable. It's basically the same exact stuff that you'll find in a lot of the name brand stuffs at the music stores. We just buy it in bulk. It's a lot cheaper. It's exactly the same stuff. Pair that with our Switchcraft or whatever hardware you're choosing, you're going to get awesome results. Just like with the plugs, there are other high quality brands of cable out there, and if you want to use one of them, it's totally fine. You're going to get awesome results either way. As long as you start with high quality materials like we're using, you're going to get a high quality result. Heck, that's what the big companies do, and then they mark up the price because it's got their name on it. We're making the exact same thing without all that markup. One quick note on bulk cable before we get started is buying in bulk is the best way to go. Try to buy as much cable as you can really swing because the more you buy, generally the cheaper per foot cost is. If you just buy a short section, maybe for one or two cables, you're going to pay more per foot than you do if you buy a larger quantity. So if you know you have to make a bunch of cables, or maybe you're going to give some away or whatever, try to buy as much as you can afford, as whatever fits your budget at the particular time, because like I said, the per foot cost is going to be a lot less. So just keep that in mind. Weigh the costs based on how much you're going to need. So let's get started making some cables. First thing we need to do, figure out how long our cables are going to be. The particular cable that I'm going to start off making is going to be 12 feet. Why 12 feet? Because it's going to work for what I need it for. If you want a 10-foot cable, cut a 10-foot piece. If you want a 20-foot cable, cut a 20-foot piece. I don't think I would go super crazy and be making, 50-foot instrument cables. I don't like mine to be really any over 20 feet, but figure out what you need, and that's the cool part. If you need an 11.5-foot cable, well, you can make an 11.5-foot cable. It's the fun part about making your own. This table is 4 feet, which makes it really easy. I just use that to measure out my cable. I give it an extra inch or two. Cut that off. There's our 12-foot cable. Now we need to strip back some of this outer insulation, but how do we know exactly how far to go? Well, to kind of gauge that, I like to use the actual plug. If I lay my cable in here, I know that the copper wire comes to the very end, and I want that to be a little bit past this terminal here. So if I just kind of lay this in place, you can sort of compare where other parts of the plug are. These little crimp terminals here get crimped onto the outer insulation. There's also a little nub right here that is part of the strain relief, and that has to catch into this outer insulation. So I don't want to strip the insulation past that nub. So if we look at the distance here, we're about a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to strip this insulation about a 1/2 inch back. Any farther, and we're going to be too far back, and we'll have to trim some of this off so that this nub can dig into this outer rubber jacket. To do that, I'm just using a utility knife, and I lightly hold it on the insulation, and I just roll the whole thing a time or two while putting very light pressure. Then if you bend that, you can see that it's just cut through the outer insulation. You can pull that right off. So here's what the inside of this Mogami cable looks like. You can see that we have the copper wires, and they're just kind of twisted around there. Depending on what cable you decided to use, some of that stuff is going to be braided, and you actually have to go in there and carefully unbraid that. You don't want to break a bunch of these. You don't want to cut a bunch of these wires. You want them all to be there. But the next step we need to do is to separate these out. And I just do that carefully, just working them back from the center conductor. And I end up working them all to one side. And then we just give them a twist, just to kind of keep them out of the way, and we're going to need them twisted anyway. So now if we're looking at this center wire here, you may look at that and just go, oh, it's just another conductor with black sheathing on it, just like on the outside. Well, I'm going to tell you, this black sheathing has got to be removed. It's actually kind of an outer insulation layer for the wire that's underneath. And I remove this exactly the same way, only I'm a little bit lighter with the utility knife blade. I'll make a little slit and then carefully peel a little section back. And then it's, for the Mogami cable anyway, it's soft enough that you can kind of just get in there and peel that off. Now you want to make sure you have a nice clean section down below here. You don't leave any little bits of fuzzies or any sort of pieces that are still sticking there. Now one thing that's pretty important about this stuff, and the main reason you want to remove this and have it nice and clean, is this is slightly conductive. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure as to what this stuff is supposed to do. Some sort of insulation, sheathing, something like that. But like I said, it's conductive, and if you leave any little shreds in there, this stuff can really mess you up. Let me show you. I've got a cable tester here which has a function very similar to a multimeter. You can also use a multimeter for this, but this has a continuity setting, and I use this to test all my cables. But if I put one of these ends on that little bit of insulation, and I stick this on the other end, you hear that? The probes are not touching. It is strictly going through that black insulation. It's really strange. So very important that you get a very clean joint when you trim that piece off and you don't have any stray bits in there. And also, if anybody can tell me the exact function of that little sheathing layer, I'd love to know. But I've had troubles with it. If you're not careful and it touches one of your connections, it'll short something out and it won't work, and then you'll have to be troubleshooting. Now we can strip back the insulation on this center conductor just a little bit as well before we start soldering. And one thing that I want to do now before I forget, and this is very important actually, we want to install the hardware for our plug. Yes, right now we have the other side unconnected. We could slide it on that. But I try to be in the habit of installing all of the parts for your jack. Because it is not fun when you solder the end on and then you realize that all of this stuff is sitting on the table next to you. These Switchcraft jacks have the metal barrel. There's a little insulating sleeve here. And one extra thing that I like to add to my cables is a little extra piece of heat shrink. This acts as a little extra strain relief. Once we solder the jack on there, this gets shrunk over top of the jack and also on this cable. And then when we slide everything else up on there, a little bit of the heat shrink will stick out the back of this plug, which is kind of a cool way to color code your cables. You could have, I don't know, red ones for a certain use and maybe different colors for different people, or who knows, whatever, but it makes it really a neat way to organize your cables. Plus, it gives it some extra strain relief. And if you want to get super crazy with it, you can have custom heat shrink printed with maybe your band's logo or your name or whatever on there. That way you have your name on your cables, and it's also an extra bit of strain relief. So that's the way I like to do it. Now that we have all these bits on here, we're ready to start making some solder connections. On the jack, we have two different conductors. We have the tip and we have the sleeve. The tip goes to this center lug here, and that goes to the center conductor on our wire. So temporarily, I'm just going to set it in place. So that's going to solder right there. This outer piece is the ground that connects to the sleeve here, and that's actually going to go down here on this tab. So our ground gets soldered here, and this connection, which goes to the tip, gets soldered to this ring here. Maybe you can see how if I'm holding this in place, the length of this ground here is a little bit long, and we can't really get a super neat connection. So I'm going to trim that back just a little bit, and I'm going to trim this back just a little bit too. I like to try to have as little extra wire in there as possible. I want my connections to be as neat as I can. So we'll trim that back just a little bit. Now we're going to come in with our soldering iron, and we're going to add a little bit of solder to these wires. I've got a little bit on the tip of the soldering iron. This is called tining the wires. So we've got our wires tinned with just a little bit of solder. Now we can start making our connections. To make this center connection, I like to bend this lug down just a little bit. So it's just at a little bit of an angle. I like it to go through the center and then have everything just lay down flat. See how that lays flat? Now, all we need to do is put a little drop of solder here, drop of solder on that bottom connector, and we've made our first connection. If you prepare everything as neat as possible to begin with, it makes the soldering process go super fast. So now I can come in here with a little hands-free thing, which will hold this in place. We can then come in with our soldering iron. When you're soldering, make sure you touch the soldering iron to both the wire as well as the terminal. When it gets to the right temperature and you touch your solder on there, it'll immediately flow out nice and smooth, and that's when you know you have the right temperature. If the solder's not flowing out smoothly, it's likely not quite hot enough yet. A couple of tips to help you with your soldering. Of course, you want to tin the ends, which helps promote good adhesion, as well as when you're soldering, you add the solder to the end of your soldering iron as well. You want to heat up both the wire as well as the terminal. You don't want to heat one or the other. You want to try to heat them both equally. And then once you touch your solder on there, it'll just flow out nice and neat. And when you're done, you want to have a nice, smooth, shiny solder joint. You don't want one that's dull. A dull solder joint can be a good indication that you have a cold solder joint. And it may be solid for now, but it might not be solid later on. You want it to be nice and shiny. Giving these a final inspection, I'm totally fine with these solder joints. Little tug test, kind of pull these around, wiggle them around. They feel nice and solid. We're ready to crimp this down. To crimp those tabs, I just use a little pair of pliers. Now the tabs are basically sitting like this, and if you can imagine the cable in the middle, you don't want to just mash them over right onto the cable because you could pinch the wires, break something internally. You just basically want to carefully curl them over. They're never going to go all the way across and capture the entire cable, but you want to just gently bend them over so that they just kind of give the cable a hug. You know what I mean, right? So I usually just kind of work them around with the pliers. I always thought like they should be a little bit longer because I don't want them, like I said, to punch into the cable, but you just kind of wrap them around there as best you can. Get them to give it a hug. Just give it a hug. Kind of just work them a little bit as best you can. That's how I do it anyway. It looks like a good hug. Hopefully you can see there how I've just sort of bent the ends around as best I can, and it's kind of hanging onto that wire. Nice and secure. The wire still can't come up out of there. I have no problem with the way those tabs are. Now, we'll slide our shrink wrap up over. I like to try to get it as far up as I can. Depending on the size of the shrink wrap, sometimes you can get it to go all the way up. This is just a little bit smaller than I wish it was, but it's going to be just fine. Work it up as far as possible. Then all we need to do is shrink it. I've got this little heat gun, which works pretty well for stuff like this. It takes a little bit longer because it's smaller, but little mini heat gun works good on this little shrink wrap project. Now we can slide the sleeve, which is slid into this metal housing. Back up, screw that down. And you can see how the shrink wrap sticks out the back, which is a look that I like I said, because you can color code things. You can put your logo on there, just kind of cool, and an extra bit of strain relief. That's one end. Super secure, super solid. Now I just need to repeat that exact same process on the other side. Overall, this process is really not difficult. I would say that most of your time is going to be spent cutting the wire, stripping back the insulation, and just preparing the connections before you even do any soldering onto the plug. The overall soldering process really only takes a couple of seconds once you get everything set up. Once you've done a few of these cables, you can almost kind of assembly line these and just knock them out in a relatively short amount of time. The second verse is same as the first, and we now have a cable with plugs on both ends. Now, we need to make sure if this is going to work. There's a few different ways you could do that. I suppose one way that doesn't require really any fancy test equipment, just plug it in and see if it works. It would tell you whether or not it works, but it won't tell you exactly what the problem is, and that's where a cable tester comes in handy. There are lots of different cable testers on the market. Behringer makes a really good one. The one I have is made by Mackie. Yeah, the Mackie that makes mixing boards. This one's really cool, and it's the one that I use. This one has a lot of different connections on there, like they should. You got to have a lot of different connections. Speak on XLR, RCAs, MIDI cables, 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch. But one thing that I really like is there's provisions on here where you can plug in some test leads and use this very similar to the continuity function on a multimeter. To test this, we just simply plug this guy in. We can see some indicator lights on here, and if we turn the knob, it tests different portions of the cable. Depends on if it's a TS cable, a TRS cable, or a TRRS cable. It'll test all the different functions on there. and we have no faults on here right now. Nothing is going straight to ground. But if you wanted to test this with a multimeter, that's really easy to do as well. I've got my multimeter here. I've got it set up for continuity mode. So you can hear we get an audible beep. Really simple. All we're going to do is go from the tip on one end to the tip on the other end. We should have continuity. And if we go from the ground to the tip, we of course should not get any sort of beep. Same thing going the other way. We get continuity on the tip, nothing on the sleeve to tip, which is good. That means nothing's shorting directly out. And of course, sleeve to sleeve, we get continuity. I do want to show you that same function using this cable tester because, like I said, this is one of the functions that I really kind of like. I like having this option. It's kind of like having a multimeter on hand when you don't really have a multimeter. It does a lot of the same thing. So you touch that together, we get a beep, and we're just going to do the same thing. Tip to tip, tip to sleeve, which is, there's nothing, which is a good thing. We go from tip to sleeve on the other way, nothing, and then sleeve to sleeve. So I do like that function quite a lot of this tester. It's just kind of neat to have different options. This one's really cool. I'm going to put links down below in the description if you want to check this out. Not sponsored whatsoever, but this is one that I like and works really well. At the end of the day though, the method of testing that you use is really not that important, but I believe that it is a big step, and that's one that you should not overlook. You just don't want to get out there and try to use your new cable without it being tested and find out that something's shorted out inside. So make sure you test them using whatever method you prefer. Since this cable tests out okay, that means we're done. We're ready to put this thing to work. And if you've been following along with the build, making your own cables, congratulations on completing your own custom instrument cable. These cables are every bit as good as anything you can buy in the music store. In fact, I couldn't tell you how many cables that look identical to this I've actually bought from the music store. Switchcraft plug, colored shrink wrap on here, and then of course the cable itself. I've bought dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of them, but being able to make them yourself saves you a lot of money, and it's quite satisfying to make them yourself as well. But let's say you wanted to step your cables up a notch. How could you do that? Well, first off, you could just try some different plugs. This is a Neutrik NP2X. It's a little bit different design, which I kind of really like. It's got built-in strain relief, and these go together similarly with a few differences. The wiring is exactly the same inside, and these are a great option. You can get these, of course, in right angle. You can get them in different configurations. They even make some of these that have a built-in switch so that when you unplug it from your instrument, it basically shuts off the plug so that you don't get that weird snapping sound. Really a cool option and a way to kind of step up your cable. Of course, you may have also seen some of those fancy cloth-wrapped cables. This is also a cable that I put together. It uses the same Mogami cable, but it has these Reen right angle plugs on here. I really like the look of these. This cable has a little sleeve on here, braided sleeve, just kind of dresses it up, which I think looks really cool. The braided sleeving is a great way to customize your cables. It really does look cool. It's available in a ton of different options. The downside of the sleeving, at least in my opinion, is it's an added cost that you don't really need on your cables. Yes, it looks cool, and I do believe that it gives for a premium feel. It really feels nice, especially with the cloth wrapped stuff, but does it really help your cable? In my opinion, not all that much. Maybe a tiny bit for durability, but it absolutely does nothing for your sound compared to this. And really, unless you just want it to look cool, I just don't think it's super necessary. By all means though, if this is the look you're going for, I'm not going to tell you not to use it. I just think for my batch of cables, I'm trying to keep the cost low and the quality high. Or maybe we could say we're making boutique cables without the boutique cable prices. It's kind of fun. Anyway, now I've got a couple of really nice custom instrument cables here. I've been in need of some new cables for a little while. Now I've got some, we're ready to go. I think a couple of these are going to end up getting donated to the school along with that bass guitar that I recently redid. If you haven't seen that 3-video series, There's a link down below in the description. You can check that out. Fun little project, making a new neck for an old Epiphone bass guitar. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful and you're able to go out now and make up your own cables. Just figure out what plugs you want to use, figure out what cable you want to use. The process is going to be basically the exact same thing. Hope you found it helpful. Thanks a lot for watching, everybody. Have fun making your own custom cables, and we'll see you next time. These turned out great. Very cool.